Balbriggan, Liam. Just to emphasise again, first off, to reiterate what Liam said, I'm from the parish myself. I'm well aware of the importance of this occasion, this anniversary to the people of Balbriggan. And personally, I'd like to say how sorry we are that we had to keep this. We couldn't advertise the event and we couldn't invite many people to it in line with the COVID restrictions. Now, on the 21st of January 2019, two very important events occurred that were to have a huge bearing on the events in Balbriggan in September 1920. The first was a group of IRA volunteers ambushed an explosive movement in Centenary, and two RIC officers directing it were lost their lives. The second one was on the same day in Dublin. The Sinn Féin TDs who so done so well in the election in December 2018, they met in the Mansion House in Dublin. They'd refused to take their seats in Westminster, and instead they formed an Irish Parliament for an Irish people, Dáil Éireann, commonly called the First Dáil. So on that occasion began the 21st of January as a date regarded as the start of the Tan War. It's often referred to as the War of Independence or the Anglo-Irish War. Now, British forces in Ireland were dependent on two bodies of men to maintain their occupation of the country. The first was the regular British Army. They were very well armed, unlimited resources of men and materials, weapons, logistics, but they had no local knowledge. They didn't know who was who, where was where, and there were many instances of their soldiers getting lost trying to get from place to place in Ireland. So they were ill equipped to deal with the new form of guerrilla warfare that the IRA had started to wage. The other body of men were the Royal Irish Constabulary and the Dublin Metropolitan Police. They were in fact the real eyes and ears of the British government in Ireland. They were their hands and fists, they were their legs and boots. So Dáil Éireann recognised early on that if they're going to establish their authority in Ireland, they'll have to deal with the RIC. And to that end, the IRA volunteers around the country started to attack barracks of the RIC, attack them, capture them and destroy them. They were very successful, so successful in this endeavour that the RIC themselves abandoned many of their barracks in the smaller towns as they moved to the safety of the bigger towns and the large cities. This allowed Dáil Éireann to establish authority in some areas of the country. For example, they set up the Republican courts, both civil and criminal courts, complete with judges, advocates and so on. Now, by the time we got to 1920, the morale of the RUC was at an all-time low. In fact, throughout the years of the Tan War, some 2,000 of its members resigned or simply left, and some of them joined the Republican forces. Others stayed on in their positions both in the RIC and the DMP to work as spies for the Republican forces, particularly for Michael Collins's men in intelligence. Now, the fact that the RUC were suffering from such a low morale was of course referred back to the cabinet in London, and they decided they had to do something to bolster this or they'd be losing their war in Ireland. They hadn't lost a colony at that stage, and this was extremely important to them. To that end, under the guidance of Winston Churchill, who was the Minister for War, they recruited a body of men from unemployed working class former soldiers, many of them of poor character. They recruited them and deployed them to Ireland so quickly to bolster up the RIC as auxiliaries that they had time neither to train them nor even to properly uniform them. So when the first of them arrived in Ireland on March 5th, 1920, they were uniformed in excess British Army uniforms, which were brown or khaki, and in police uniforms which were black, and they quickly were called the Black and Tans. They were deployed, over 8,000 of them, to Ireland, and the second force they recruited were the auxiliaries. The auxiliaries were from the officer class, ex-soldiers of the British Army, and they were far more disciplined and far more dangerous to the Republican forces in Ireland. The Black and Tans came so quickly, they deployed them so quickly, they initially trained them in the Phoenix Park where they were billeted, but they needed a bigger quarters. So they brought them down here to Gormerson Army Camp, just 3 miles outside the town of Balbriggan. Now, of course, when the Black and Tans came to Gormerson, the RIC training officers came with them, and 2 of them were 2 brothers from Mayo, Peter Burke and Michael Burke. And on the day of the March, the fateful day of September the 20th, the 2 Burke brothers, one a sergeant, the other a head constable, were called to police headquarters in Dublin, where they were informed that they were both going to be promoted. And head constable Peter Burke was about to be promoted to district inspector, so he'd be in charge of the whole area here. On their way home, they stopped in what was in a pub up the road that is now, it was Smith's pub, it is now the Mill Race, and it's still there today. They went in there to drink, where they met a bunch of black and tans who were already in there. At some stage during the night, a melee broke out when the black and tans assaulted some of the local residents who were in the pub. The owner of the pub, Mrs. Smith, she said that she wouldn't serve them anymore, and she asked them to leave. They refused. So she sent down for the RIC men who were stationed. This is their barracks here, the red building here beside us, as you can see, only a few yards from that particular pub. The RIC men here went up and are encountering Chief Constable Burke, who they probably knew at that stage was about to be their leader, their senior officer. They promptly left and came back here taking no action. Now, by coincidence, and history is often affected by coincidences that make huge differences both in good and in tragedy. By coincidence, a group of local Republicans were meeting in what was then Connolly's Bar, which is the Hanlon Palace here now. As you can see, right next door to the RIC office, and just down the road where the two RIC men and the black and tans were drinking up the road. Now, they were meeting to organise finances for the local volunteers, and by chance, 3 of the most senior IRA volunteers in this area were at that meeting. One was Michael Rock from the Knoll, who was the officer commanding the 1st Battalion, which would have covered all of Balbriggan, Skerries, North County Dublin out to the Knoll, Boscadan and Gormerson. Another was Willie Corcoran, who was the 2nd Lieutenant of the battalion, and the 3rd was Jack Gaynor. Jack Gaynor was captain of the Balbriggan company, which means he was the most senior officer of Balbriggan. Now, 2 men came down from the pub up here and informed the men meeting here, the Republicans meeting in this pub, that the black and tans were about to, they thought the black and tans were about to kill 2 of the local residents up at the other pub. Now, we have a wonderful record of history in that in the 1950s, the Bureau of Military Affairs took statements from some 1,774 volunteers from the Tan War period, and all 3 volunteers I mentioned here gave statements at that time. They're fully accessible now on the internet, and anybody can read them. So we know from their statements, or we believe from their statements, that Jack Gaynor was already armed, but the other 2 were not. In fact, nobody else in the pub was armed. But Willie Corcoran, who lived just around the corner here in Canard Street, he was in charge of a small arms dump. So Michael Rock sent him up to get 2 handguns and ammunition, and then the 3 volunteers from here went up to the pub that is now the Mill Race. And where the traffic lights were up here, there's a small lane where they're able to use that to get into the back of the pub, and they entered the pub that way. Now, Jack Gaynor didn't enter the pub, but there's no record of exactly what his role was in it, but we know from their training that one of them would have stayed at the door to guard the entrance when the other 2 went in. So Willie Corcoran and Mick Rock entered the pub, they pulled their guns, they ordered the black and tans to let 2 men they were holding go, and then they told both the 2 RIC officers and the black and tans to leave. At that stage, the 2 Burke brothers rushed, the phrase was they rushed them, then the Burke brothers would have both been armed, and Michael Rock shot the 2 of them. Peter Burke died almost instantly, and his brother Michael Burke was seriously injured but later made a full recovery. Now, we can assume that the black and tans who were in the pub at the time quickly made their way back to their base here in Gormerson, because at 11 o'clock, only a little over an hour later, at least 100 and up to 150 black and tans arrived here in the town, and they pulled the lorries up outside, right here where people are standing here, right outside the RIC station. There are multiple accounts of the time of what happened next, because the journalist based in Dublin came down the following day and were able to interview lots of people, so there are many accounts of what happened. The black and tans got out of their trucks. Many people said a lot of them were already intoxicated, and they immediately started firing their weapons and smashing windows around this area. They then went over to what was then a pub here in the next corner where the medical centre is. That was Dempsey's, and the Dempsey family were a well-known local Republican family. So they ransacked that pub, they stole lots of liquor, of course, and they burned it to the ground. They then started to proceed up the street here, which is Canard Street, burning houses, looting houses and burning houses as they went. And Willie Corcoran was fortunate, his sister, he'd gone to bed, his sister woke him up, and he got out the back door as the tans were coming in the front door. Now, there was a local man here, not a local man, there was a man in digs here at the time who was an ex-British soldier who many believe was actually sent over here as a spy, and he was using the name Straw. Many witnesses in the town saw Straw with the Black and Tans, pointing out the houses of the various Republicans around the town. And in that way, the Black and Tans are able to grab Seamus Lawless and Sean Gibbons, two men who turned out to be extremely brave and courageous volunteers. Now the Tans grabbed those two men and they brought them down here to the RIC barracks, where, in the words of the Tans, they were interrogated. In reality, they were tortured, as both the Black and Tans and the RIC were determined to find the names of the other volunteers in the town. Now, to their credit, neither Seamus Lawless nor Sean Gibbons gave them the name of a single volunteer in the town, despite the fact that they were beaten. Some accounts say that at one stage the two men were put against a wall, told they were going to be executed, and live rounds were fired around them. And they were terrorised and beaten here, but the record says that the only thing that Sean Gibbons told him was his name and his rank in the IRA, and the only thing that Seamus Lawless told him was his own name. So they protected the other men in the town here. Now the Tans continued their looting. This pub here they burnt down as well, Conway's. They proceeded up the street here. They ransacked houses as they went. They ransacked shops as they went. And they arrived where the two pubs are at the corner, 300 yards up here on the Drogheda Road. One is now the Milestone. It was then the Gladstone, across the road from us, the Harrows. They looted and burned down those two pubs. They then proceeded further on up where there was a clothing factory, and they burned that to the ground. It was one of the major employers in the town. So, meanwhile, Seamus Lawless and Sean Gibbons, later on in the night, they were dragged out of here. They were brought over to this bridge, and both men were bayoneted to death. Now we know that they were later shot, but we know they were bayoneted to death from the coroner's report. Now, the whole town of Balbriggan, the people of Balbriggan, have a large debt to these two volunteers. In his statement to the Bureau of Military Archives in later years, Jack Gaynor said that there was at least 30 volunteers who were active in the town of Balbriggan. And the town of Balbriggan was one company in the 1st Brigade, Muscat Gormston was another company, the Knoll was another company. So in the vicinity of Balbriggan and its immediate environs, we know that there was at least 60 active volunteers. Now, both Seamus Lawless and Sean Gibbons would have known most of them, if not indeed all of them. And yet, they didn't give a single name, despite being tortured, terrorised, brutalised and then murdered. These two brave volunteers didn't give a single name of another man in this town, or near this town. Now, there must be hundreds, if not thousands, of people now who are descended from men who were volunteers at that time in this area. And we should be aware that had Lawless and Gibbons broken down and given their names, they would have been on the death list for the Black and Tans, and many of them would have been killed. So there are plenty of people around in this town and scattered around the world who owe their very existence to the courage of these two men. And we as a people should always be grateful to them. Now, the sacking of Balbriggan was important for a number of reasons beyond the importance of Balbriggan itself. It played an important part in the history of this country. Because Balbriggan was close to Dublin, and all the international journalists here to cover the Tan War were based in Dublin, mostly in the Shelburne Hotel, they were all down here the following day when the town was still smoking, and when there were plenty of witnesses here, and they brought photographers with them. And so the sacking of Balbriggan, the news of the sacking of Balbriggan, was headline news in newspapers all over the Western world, from New York to Paris, from London to Sydney, the headline news. So that played a big part in bringing support for the cause here in Ireland, particularly from the Irish diaspora. The other important thing about it was that the sacking of Balbriggan was the first in a series of events by both the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries, which were to mimic the sacking of Balbriggan over and over and over again. Milltown Malbay was sacked by the Black and Tans. Thurles was sacked by the Black and Tans. Cork City, the whole city centre, was burnt down by the auxiliaries. Trim was sacked by the auxiliaries. In fact, after the behaviour of the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries was so bad that after the sacking of Trim, the officer commanding the auxiliaries, Brigadier General Crozier, a career soldier, he resigned his commission in disgust, and he expressed that in his writings in later years, his disgust at the way the British Crown Forces behaved in Ireland during the Tan War. So before I finish today, I should say, we should all remember the names of Seamus Lawless and Sean Gibbons. They're two extremely important men in this town. And there are people alive today with families who wouldn't exist were it not for the courage of these two men who, despite being tortured and beaten, gave away the names. And it would have been understandable had they broken, but despite their treatment, they gave away the names of not one single volunteer in or around this town. And this town owes them a great debt. So perhaps when people walk past this bridge in the future, maybe occasionally stop and pause. And if you have your children with you, perhaps explain to them why these two men are so important to this town and why this town will never ever forget their commitment and their courage and their sacrifice. Gur míle maith agaibh go leor.